Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asuk b'divrei Torah. Baruch na Adonai Eloheinu את דברי תורתך בפינו ובפיך בית ישראל, ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאיך בית ישראל. כולנו יודע שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה. ברוך אתה אדוני מלמד תורה לעמו ישראל.
אמן.
אמן.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר בך בנו מכל עמים ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen.
Amen.
I must say, Arthur's been very good the last couple of days because he knows exactly where to say Amen. And I feel for the rest of you guys, I have to hold up a sign like at the airport when somebody arrived before the coronavirus date to say Amen.
Okay.
One of those.
It's a very simple technique I
we've only been
use.
doing it for like.
James, it's very simple. When you hear Yisrael, the
right.
third one, you hear it the first time, the second time. When you hear the third Yisrael at the end, you hear Israel one in the middle, and then at the end, the third Yisrael, say Amen automatically. I just know when it's coming.
Exactly. So what I'll do in
pattern.
future is I'll make a gesture to guys to say Amen because I'm doing the bracha for you, to have it in mind for you. All right, guys, let's get started. So what we're doing is we're discussing on the Shulchan Aruch and the Mishnah Brura, they're both section 188. Okay. And the Mishnah Brura can be found on what do you call it? Subsection 32 of chapter 188, and the Shulchan Aruch subsection 10.
Yes, my grandma. Sorry.
Oh yes, all right. Do you want me to do the share in dedication of someone?
Yeah, my granddad's also yours, obviously with my mom as well.
Yes,
Sorry,
yes.
but
Tell me what his name is. Sarah
Timia, but Israel, yeah.
Okay, so we'll do the share in the name of Sarah Timia Bat Yisrael. Okay. All right. What a pleasure. Thank you, Stephen. All right. I wish you long life. So the Mishnah Brura and the Shulchan Aruch, section 188, and this applies to a meal that stretches in the next day. It's by Rabbi Daniel Brody. So basically, if you're eating a meal that's stretched into the following day, one goes after the day during which the meal was started. So, for example, I think Sludash Shishit is a great example. So if you continue after Shabbos, as we usually used to do at Shul, where it gets dark, you still say the additions for Shabbat. You know, Ratzai, etc. Even though the benching is effective on Motzei Shabbat, you still add those additions. The same applies by a meal on Rosh Chodesh, Purim or Chanukah, that continues into the night that follows. One still mentions the relevant Ya'aleh v'Yavol and Ala Nisim, if it's going into technically the next day. So what do we mean by the next day? The non-Jewish day starts at midnight, just after midnight at 12 a.m. And with the Jewish calendar, how it starts is on sunset. So it's technically the same secular day, but a different Hebrew day. All right, so just one thing on that. Davening Mariv following... so if you're davening Mariv and it forces the following day. So for example, if you daven Mariv before benching, you do not mention the addition of the meal that started earlier because he has already declared it to be the following day. Once a person davens Mariv, he no longer goes after the earlier day. So say, for example, you went for a meal, you had a meal, and then you kind of forgot to bench and you did Mariv, and you came back, then you don't add, for example, if you're doing the Mariv for during the week, the Ritzai, because you've already brought in the new week. Okay? Shabbos into Rosh Chodesh. If Rosh Chodesh falls directly after Shabbat, one is left with a dilemma. Does he mention Shabbat, which pertains to the previous day in which the meal started, or does he mention Rosh Chodesh, which pertains to the current day after Shabbos? So the general rule is that he still only mentions Shabbos as long as he hasn't davened. So exactly the same principle would apply. This is only if he never continued eating into the night. But if he continues eating after dark, then he only mentions the Rosh Chodesh, since it's an absolute obligation where Shabbat is the subject of dispute. So this is a subject of discussion, and some poskim rule that One says both the earlier and the later one, in other words, both Shabbat and Yale V'Yavor, and thus it's advisable to finish one's meal early so as to avoid the issue. So just something to note, if Shabbos went into Purim or Chanukah and one continues eating, one only mentions Shabbat. The reason is because Purim and Chanukah are less obligatory than Shabbos. Okay? All right, guys, we're going to start with the Gemara. Now. Yeah.
I don't know why even Shuna. So they start Minchet quarter to 6 now. So they normally finish about 6 minutes. And they have a shear to about 5 past 10 past 6. Then they daven Mari, but it's already before Shkia. How's that work on? Now with the Shema.
So that's a good question. If you have to repeat the Shema of the Shkia. A lot of shuls, technically, and some of this is a big problem. They start Mariv before before it's what you call halachic sunset, and Shkia is that time of suffix, of question whether or not it's still the day or the following day because nightfall has occurred. And in that case, one repeats the Shema. So this is generally a problem that occurs in summer. What we're talking about here is a case where you've got a strong issue where Rosh Chodesh in certain cases has a stronger halachic base than Shabbos if you're dragging one meal to another. So it's important to finish before sunset. All right, guys, we're going to start the Gemara. Now, what I want to do is I want to share the screen and just show you what we had in mind. Just give me 1 second. Let me just see if I can share my screen. Okay. All right. Now, I want you guys to have a look at something. Stephen, do you want to read this?
What's this, Damon?
If a dog took a biscuit. Yeah, if a dog took a biscuit, read that part.
From the coals on which he was baking, he went to stack of grain sheaves. Where it ate the biscuit and set fire to the stack.
Yeah.
The biscuit, the dog's owner pays full damages. And for the stack, he pays half the damage.
Right. Okay. So this is what I want you to bear in mind, guys, is that we started dealing yesterday with Reish Lakish and Rav Yochanan. And Reish Lakish basically deems fire is like one's arrows. In other words, one's force. That when you put the fire into motion, then basically you're responsible from that point because it's as if you've released arrows and that force continues the fire to go. Your catalyst force. So that's Rav Yochanan. So Reish Lakish said it's not the case because a fire needs a secondary force. We learned if we look at the Torahs of fire, when we said that a stone, a knife, and a burden on a roof that blew off the roof and in a wind and land, before it landed where it became what you call a stationary hazard as a pit, it smashed on the windscreen of your next door neighbor, that is considered a Torah of fire. And since that's a Torah of fire, because it needs a secondary force like the wind, Reish Lakish holds that you can't say it's your arrows. Why can't you say it's your arrows? Because an arrow, if you shot a bow and an arrow, would imply that the wind might deter the arrow from hitting its target, but there's no secondary force other than your energy to draw the arrow back to allow the arrow to continue. Therefore, he considers a fire as one's property, meaning just as one has an obligation to look after their property from creating damage, like one's ox or one's pet, you have an obligation for the fire that you created not to cause damage to your neighbor, okay? And in that particular case, we learn why, I don't know where Stephen's disappeared to, I'm not 100% sure, but where we ended off is we said that why does Rav Yochanan not hold Firstly, why does Reish Lakish not hold by Rav Yochanan and it's deemed his property? Reish Lakish not explain liability for one's fire, Rav Yochanan does. Reish Lakish would say to you, one's arrows travel through his force, whereas fire does not travel through his force. Okay, that's very straightforward. And why does Rav Yochanan not explain liability for one's fire, as Reish Lakish does? Because Rav Yochanan would say to you, property has substance, whereas this fire has no substance. What do we mean it has no substance? Fire is ethereal, meaning it doesn't have any tangible physical qualities, and therefore it can't be considered a physical damaging object like a property. Does that make sense? So fire is a gas. So we see reasons for both, and we want to know how this plays out in the Mishnah. So what the key is and why I shared the screen is it has to follow the wording of the Mishnah. So the wording of the Mishnah has to work both of their explanation. The Mishnah came before Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So their interpretation has to fit within the exact wording of the Mishnah and the integrity of the Mishnah. So when we share the Mishnah, I just want to bring something to your attention. Both of them explain as follows, and I have to share the screen to show you this. If a dog took a biscuit from the coals on which it was baking and went to a stack of grain leaves, where it ate the biscuit and set fire to the grain stack. For the biscuit, the dog's owner pays full damages. Now, what did we explain this as, guys?
This is not regal, the other one, Shane.
Yes, correct, because Shane means the animal derived physical gratification by eating the biscuit in the damaged party's yard, and therefore he pays full damages. And for the stack, he pays half damages. Now, you don't have a problem if you want to explain like Rav Yochanan, because Rav Yochanan would say as follows, is that for the biscuit, you pay full damages as in Shane, and for the stack, he pays half damage. Why? Because he explains it as one's arrows, meaning that if you set fire to one portion of the stack and the rest catches a light, you don't have a problem in this case. Why? Because we said that I've got a bra going on in Renana, and Arthur comes to me with one of his pets, and his pet decides to take some food off the bra, of which a piece of coal is stuck to it. And then while it's eating that food and gobbles it up, it half burns itself and then tosses the rest of the food with a piece of coal is stuck onto that stack of sheaves, grain sheaves, and it catches alight. Now, it's not a problem according to Rav Yochanan, because if Rav Yochanan says it's basically like the dog's arrows or whoever's causing the fire's arrows, meaning that the dog set the fire in motion, then who's responsible? The dog's owner. But you've got a problem with regards to Reish Lakish, because Reish Lakish said, well, at the end of the day, it was my coals and my fire, and then I can't obligate Arthur for his dog causing the hassle because it's not Arthur's coals or fire. So therefore, it's the property of the fire owner that is responsible. So that's a problem, because in that particular case, there's two problems. The first problem is that Arthur doesn't own anything. It's my fire that caused the problem. But the second problem is that what are we going to do with the Mishnah according to Reish Lakish? Because how does Reish Lakish determine that you pay half the damage for the stack? Because Reish Lakish says that nothing is paid for the stack by Arthur, because it's deemed my property, the coals, and therefore Arthur's dog is not responsible, because whoever coals it is or fire is responsible for the damage. Therefore, all Arthur's dog has done is I've used my coals to damage my own grain of sheaves. Does that make sense? So according to Reish Lakish, we have a problem. Why do we have a problem with the text? Because the text says, and for the stack, he pays half the damage. And if Reish Lakish says you don't pay anything for the stack, we understand why for the biscuit, according to Reish Lakish and Rav Yochanan, you pay full damages, because that's an issue of shame. That's an issue of shame in the damaged party's yacht. So there you pay. So what are we going to do with the stack? He pays half the damage. Does that make sense, guys? Why we have a problem with Reish Lakish?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because why would the dog only pay for the half damage of the stack when Reish Lakish considers the coals my property and Arthur's not responsible for his dog creating the issue? Why would he pay half damages for the stack? Because it's my coals. If he deems one's fire is one's own property. So what are we going to do with the stack that he pays half damage for? This is what the Reish Lakish would say to you. Reish Lakish would turn around to you and say, look, when the dog was eating the biscuit, it kind of like burnt the dog's mouth because the piece of coal was split, and the dog tossed the biscuit. And when you toss the biscuit, then that is an act of tzoros. And you pay only for where the biscuit landed, because that is an act of tzoros on the direct place that the biscuit landed, and you don't pay for the rest of the stack of grain, only exactly where the biscuit landed. So whether or not you interpret it as carrying time unusual, that the dog tossed the biscuit, and for that reason, you pay half damages only on the point of contact of the coal to the grain, but not for the rest of the grain sheaf, or you say tzoros through the dog's horse. You can't obligate for the rest of the fire because it's actually technically my coals. It's not Arthur's fault for his dog, according to Reish Lakish. So you pay for the direct spot of damage and not for the rest of the grains, the stack of grains. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Gavin, what? Okay.
Yeah, no, it does.
So Rav Yochanan, we don't have a problem because Rav. Okay. So according to Rav Yochanan, we don't have a problem. Why don't we have a problem? Because Rav Yochanan deems fire is equivalent to one's arrows or one's horse. So if Arthur's dog took my coals and set fire to my grain, then Arthur is responsible for his animal because Arthur's animal actually was the cause of it in this particular case. Now, yesterday you saw it according to Reish Lakish. Now you're seeing it a little bit more according to Rav Yochanan, a little bit. So do you know what I'm saying? So it's interesting. We're going to go backwards and forwards and see that there's different ways to look at it. So in this particular case, in order for Rav Yochanan to stay integrous to the Mishnah, he says you pay full payment for shame for the biscuit, same as Reish Lakish, and half payment damages, because he says there's no problem with half payment damages. The dog is actually causing the tzoros, because if the dog sets it to that particular part and the rest of the sheaf of grain catches fire, it doesn't matter. Arthur still pays for his dog because Arthur's dog set the fire in motion. Doesn't matter that the fire is my property. Arthur's dog set it in motion. All right. So as long as that part's clear, I'm going to go on with the Mishnah. Okay. I think I've explained it well. I've explained it in a very informal way, just to make sure that you guys understand what's going on. Right. Now, we're on page 22a2. So the Gemara now is challenging Reish Lakish from a different source. Okay, let me just tell you what source he's challenging him from. He says, the Gemara says, come learn a proof from the following Mishnah. Now, this Mishnah occurs later in 62b of Bava Kamma. It says, if a camel laden with flax was passing through the public domain, whereupon its flax went into a shop and was set ablaze by the lamp of the shopkeeper, and it set fire to a mansion outside, the camel owner is liable to pay for the damage. I'm just going to repeat this again. If a camel laden with flax was passing through the public domain, okay, and its flax went into a shop and was set ablaze by the lamp of the shopkeeper, and it then set fire to a mansion outside, the camel's owner was liable. Why is this contradictory to the first one. I want you guys to explain to me. Give it, try it, take a stab at it.
Come again. What's the question, James?
Damn, just say that again.
Okay,
because-
Stephen, see? Firstly, Shane, you don't have to guess because you weren't here yesterday. So you off the
I'm just a
hook. You
guest.
can just enjoy the shear. The rest of the guys are not
Okay.
off the hook.
All right.
Okay, so just enjoy the shear. So what we're saying is as follows: is there's something very wrong in the first part of the brisa. What did it say? It said that basically Reish Lakish has got a problem here because we learned that if it's Marcos, Arthur brings his dog and he comes to me for lunch, and I'm setting a bra out, and Arthur's dog stole some food off the bra, and then set fire to my grain sheaves. Then Arthur's dog is not responsible according to Reish Lakish, because Reish Lakish is determining who owns the fire as being responsible, that person's fire is their property and their obligation is to look after it. It doesn't matter that Arthur's dog set it alight. It matters that it's my cause and it's my property. So therefore, Arthur's not responsible. According to Rabbi Yochanan, Arthur's dog is responsible because it's the dog's force that set the fire in motion. So the Bryson now makes sense, but now the Gemara is bringing a contradicting Mishnah in 62b of Bava Kamma. That says, listen, you've got a camel. The camel has got a whole lot of flax. Now, if you know what flax is, that thing, the minute there's a flame, the whole thing will just go up in flames. It's almost like flammable material that's going to catch a light immediately. And what happens is this camel went through, and the guy had a lamp in the inside of his place. And then basically the camel went through, caught all the flax alight, and it set the whole mansion alight of the shopkeeper, because basically the guy had his mansion by the shop. Okay, often people used to live by their premises, etc. So now it's saying, why is the camel owner responsible? Because what we learned is who owns the fire according to Reish Lakish is responsible. So the shopkeeper owns the fire. So it's the shopkeeper's fire. My camel goes through, it has flax. It basically, the flax catches a light and it sets the shopkeeper's mansion on fire. Now all of a sudden, I'm responsible for my camel that set alight the mansion of the shopkeeper or anybody's mansion, whichever. Why am I responsible as the camel owner and not the shopkeeper's fire? Because according to Reish Lakish, whose fire is it? It's the shopkeeper's fire in this store.
Yeah.
No, it should be the shopkeeper that's responsible. That's what the Mishnah is saying. It's saying, why is the camel's owner responsible? It's bringing a Mishnah in 62b to contrast this and bring a challenge to Reish Lakish. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But do you understand the question? You don't have to have an answer, but do you understand the question?
I don't really.
If you don't,
I'm a little confused. I mean, I understand the one part with the responsibility is the fire and the dog take it. And the one guy says, okay, the guy started the fire, he's responsible. And the other guy says, no, it's actually the dog because he spread the thing. But I don't quite understand how it links up in what you're saying.
Okay, so let me say it to you like this.
Okay.
Rav Yochanan, you don't have a problem because he obligates your dog Arthur for creating the fire to my grain and sheaves.
Okay.
Reish Lakish said, listen, there's nothing to do with any sort of thing other than who owns the fire, because whoever owns the fire has an obligation to look after it, because fire is deemed one's property, just like you have to look after the ox that you have that doesn't go rogue.
Yeah.
So since the fire is technically my property, and it's that's my problem. So even if your dog took a coal and set a large grain of sheaves, of my grain of sheaves, it's still my fire. Therefore, I'm sitting with the problem, not you.
Okay.
So that's fine. So Reish Lakish, we hear that.
I got that part.
the Gemara is bringing a case from Mishnah 62b and says, listen, we've got a different case here. There's a shopkeeper and he's got lamps. They never had electricity in those days to light up his shop. It's at night.
Yeah.
And this camel goes through the shop and it's having flax on its back.
Yeah.
And basically the whole flax catches a light. And then there's a mansion next door, whether it's the shopkeeper or whether it's somebody else's mansion, it doesn't matter. The bottom line is they hold me responsible for my camel as having caused the fire in this Mishnah, and not the shopkeepers for it being his fire. Now, according to Reish Lakish, whose fire is it? Whose fire is it?
It's the owner.
It's the owner of the shop. Yeah.
Correct, it's the shopkeeper. So therefore, Reish Lakish, how would he answer this? Because the Mishnah is saying, I as the camel owner am responsible, whereas it's basically saying in the Mishnah that I, the camel owner, is responsible, and Reish Lakish would have to answer, why isn't the shopkeeper responsible since it's his fire? Because Reish Lakish says it's the person that owns the fire. The fire is his property. He should be responsible. Kevin has a question. Just hang on, Kevin, I'm putting you on speakerphone. Give me 1 second, my friend. Yeah? Speak.
Okay. Why, if the fire is considered the shopkeeper's fire, then it seems to absolve responsibility from the camel owner. So that wouldn't seem reasonable.
Okay, it's a reasonably good answer. That we've got a general question of Reish Lakish at the moment, which Kevin is asking. I'm just going to repeat it for those that didn't hear it, and it makes sense to me. Is that it doesn't seem reasonable in either case, whether Arthur comes to me and his dog caused the fire just because it was my coals, while Arthur isn't responsible, nor in this case of the shopkeeper, while the shopkeeper could be responsible because the shopkeeper's minding his own business and has a fire to keep his chocolate, and the next thing a camel's causing the issue. So we don't understand Reish Lakish of how he could say that the owner of the fire is responsible in all cases. That's Kevin's question, and I think it's a good question. The answer is we don't know yet. We have to see how this all plays out. The only thing that our obligation to do now is firstly to explain Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish's point of view, and also not to judge the one, because unfortunately, it's been centuries and we're not able to ask the people directly. And I want to live till 120 in good health. And so I want everybody to live to 120 in good health. So I'm not in a rush to ask him directly either. Okay. Amen. So what I was going to say to you is, Kevin, I think it's a very good point. We're going to see how it plays out. But in principle here, all we've got to know is, how would Reish Lakish answer this question? Because Reish Lakish has to answer the question and say, well, how would he explain this particular Mishnah? Because to say that in this case, the camel's owner is responsible for causing the fire, not the shopkeeper. So in that particular case, how would Reish Lakish explain it, since it's the shopkeeper's fire? Does that make sense? So this is what we're going to answer at this point now. So what we're going to say is as follows, is that Reish Lakish would say to you the following, right? He would say, I'm going to try and put this in the neatest English possible. So the camel owner is responsible because he should not have made the load of flax so large that it would be extended into the doorway of the shop as it passed by. So firstly, this is in the beginning of 22b, which we haven't reached here. It's basically saying that the problem is that the owner of the camel is responsible for two reasons. What are the two reasons? Well, the two reasons is that firstly, you should never create a hazard on your animal where the flax is out of proportion, where it's an accident waiting to happen. obviously, if the animal is entering into an area where there are flames to light up the shop, etc., and the animal's owner decides to pack it with flammable material, whose fault is that? Whose fault is that? That's actually the fault of the camel owner. So how does Reish Lakish, it still doesn't answer to me how Reish Lakish would determine the responsibility. I think the only thing that I could say in that particular case is in the case of Arthur's that came to me for lunch, and Arthur had a dog. In that particular case, the dog of its own volition would choose to take something off the braai and then obviously set fire to my grain of sheaves. It's the dog's fault. But in this case of the camel, the Gemara in 22b1 is implying that the owner of the camel packed the camel with flammable material and let it into a shop where the animal had no business being in a shop, and it was laden with flammable material, and it was packed to the brim, where obviously as walking through with the lamps, etc., it was going to catch a light. So therefore it was the owner's fault for having caused this. Whereas in Arthur's case, where his came to me for lunch, his dog did something unusual. Arthur wasn't remiss. The dog did something of its own volition. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? So that's one issue. Then you've got a second issue, and that second issue is the fact that what we say is that the actual, in the case of the coals, Reish Lakish obligates the exact point of direct contact, because he doesn't deem that a fire, that if I start a fire in my place that extends, is the responsibility of anybody other than the owner of that fire. So if I set fire and that fire spreads, it's my responsibility because it's my fire. But if I set fire for it and it's somebody else's fire, it's the owner of that fire. So in other words, point of direct contact means I'm obligated, because that's a case of direct touch. So he calls it a torda of regel, where that exact spot point of contact is. Okay, so in that case, that's why he says there's half payment damages, because it was unusual form of regel in the case of the biscuit that touches the grain of sheaves. For the rest of the grain, you're not obligated. So in the fire of the mansion, it would describe that the camel would go through running in panic and actually set fire to the mansion with direct contact. Okay? All right, so as long as you principally understand the difference, and the reason that this is the difference is the Mishnah carries on and says if the shopkeeper placed his lamp outside the shop in the public domain, then the shopkeeper is liable to pay the damage. Why would the shopkeeper be liable to pay the damage outside the shop in the public domain?
Yeah, it's a very good question. In the public domain, because normally you're not responsible in the public domain.
No. This isn't Shane or Regal, because it says the public in the field of another. It doesn't say that for fire, and it doesn't say that for pit.
Yeah, this is
Yeah, Kev?
and this is fire.
Yeah. Kevin has a question. Hang on. Kev, what's your question?
I thought it was going to be pit, but you just said it isn't. He created like after he had a fire there,
Yes, Kevin's correct. No, Kevin's correct. Kevin is saying like this, that a pit is considered one's obstruction, just like it's a hazard. The fire is a hazard. If you're creating a fire outside where animals are walking and people are walking past, somebody's shaitel is going to get scorched. Somebody's clothing is going to catch a light. So in that particular case, you've got a business lighting the inside of your shop. And since the camel was laden with flax, and an animal has no business being inside a shop, especially bulging with flax, where it's flammable, in this case, the camel's owner is responsible. But in the particular case of the shopkeeper keeping his fire outside, he's the one that is absolutely responsible, okay? Because he's creating a hazard. It's not like the camel owner. With regards to just one thing, there is an exception. Rav Yehuda says during the time of Hanukkah, no shopkeeper is responsible for keeping the fire for the Chanukiah, for the menorah, outside for the flame that it causes, because there is a public mitzvah to acknowledge the miracle in public using your menorah and your Chanukiah. So in that case, every shop owner and every homeowner has a menorah outside, and people are aware it's Hanukkah and are extra vigilant to make sure that they're aware that there's flames in every shop and every home outside to publicize the mitzvah. So in that case, Rav Yehuda said you're not obligated during Hanukkah, but the rest of the period of the year, if a shopkeeper makes a fire outside where it could be a public hazard and catch people alive or animals or property, you're responsible. But inside his shop, he's entitled to light his shop, and that an animal that was laden with an overburden of flammable flats has no business going into a shop, so therefore the camel's owner is responsible, even though the fire belongs to the shopkeeper. And in that case, it's different to Arthur coming over to me for a bra when his dog does some random act of stealing something on the fire and then tosses the biscuit, which lights my grain of sheaves, of which it's my fire according to Reish Lakish, and Arthur doesn't have to pay. And according to Rav Yochanan, Arthur would have to pay because it's deemed his arrows, meaning soros. It's the force of the dog that set this whole process in motion. In other words, the dog carried the flame to the stack of grain or tossed it there. And in that case, the dog's owner is responsible. All right, guys, we finished. We're going to go through more of it in detail and read it properly direct tomorrow. But this was more conversational to explain the points of view.
Okay, mate.
Listen, thank you. I just wanted to say something. Damon, thanks. Sorry, I actually forgot what pit and fire do in a public domain. So thank you.
No problem.
It's,
Thanks for that
no,
answer.
you're liable. No,
Yeah.
I'd forgotten. We haven't really covered it in a public domain. But you're right. It's only Regal and Shane that are exempt in a public domain. So I apologize.
Because of the pasuk. Correct. In the field of the
So we hadn't actually tackled them in the public domain, so I hadn't actually applied it. Now we applied it, so now I know. Thank you.
All right, guys, lovely to see you, and I wish you a good day.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, likewise. And Stephen, thanks for joining if you're still there.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks, man.
Nice to see you, and wish
Nice
you a
to
long
see you.
life,
I wish you a long life.
Yeah. Long life.
Thank you.
And Damon,